He never thought a simple phone call could change everything in his life. The day had started like any other, quiet and uneventful. The sky outside was heavy with clouds, and the house felt colder than usual. He sat at the edge of his couch, staring at the flickering light in the corner of the room. It had been buzzing for weeks, sparking on and off as if it had its own secret life. He ignored it at first, like he ignored so many things in his life: his loneliness, the silence that pressed against him each night, the feeling that his world had somehow gone dim without him noticing. But that morning, when the light finally gave up and died, he picked up the phone and called for help. He didn't know that this simple act would be the beginning of something he never expected, something that would pull him out of the shadows he had lived in for far too long. When the voice on the other end answered, he hesitated. It wasn't because he doubted the need for an electrician, it was because of the weight of his own silence. For so long, he had lived in the safety of routines: work, home, sleep, repeat. Speaking to strangers was rare for him, and inviting one into his home even rarer. Yet here he was, giving his address, hearing the calm tone of the electrician assuring him someone would be over shortly. He hung up and sat in the dim room, his heart beating faster than it should have, as though the walls around him already sensed something was about to change. That he thought about the loneliness that had crept into every corner of his home. He had lived here for years, surrounded by furniture that no longer felt like his, photographs that carried smiles from a life that felt distant. He remembered his last relationship, the way it had ended with words spoken in anger, words that still echoed inside him on sleepless nights. Since then, he had built walls around his heart, convincing himself that safety was better than risk. The broken light wasn't just a broken light. It felt like a reflection of everything he had been avoiding, a reminder that even the smallest things can crumble when ignored for too long. As he waited, he caught himself pacing. He didn't usually care about appearances, but now he was picking up clothes from the couch, straightening the magazines on the table, and wiping dust off shelves he hadn't touched in weeks. He told himself it was because he didn't want to look careless, but deep down, he knew it was something else. The thought of someone stepping into his world stirred a nervousness inside him, the kind of nervousness that comes when change is already knocking at the door. When the knock finally came, it startled him more than it should have. His chest tightened, and for a moment, he considered pretending he wasn't home. But he forced himself forward, his hand gripping the doorknob as though it weighed more than he could carry. He opened the door, and the sight before him was unexpected. Standing there was a man in work boots and a navy shirt, carrying a toolbox in one hand. His presence filled the doorway, not just with his size but with an energy that immediately shifted the air. His eyes, calm and steady, met his, and in that single glance something stirred deep within him. The electrician introduced himself with a polite smile, his voice warm and grounded. It wasn't just a greeting, it was the kind of voice that made people feel seen, even in their silence. He stepped inside, carrying the faint scent of sawdust and fresh air, the kind of scent that reminded him of open spaces and freedom. Watching him set down his tools, he felt a strange pull. It wasn't love at first sight, not the way movies described it. It was quieter than that, deeper. It was recognition, as if something inside him whispered, "This is someone who matters." As the electrician began examining the broken light, he found himself watching more closely than he should have. The way his hands moved with confidence, the way he seemed comfortable in silence yet never cold. There was something magnetic about it, something that drew him closer even though he kept his distance. He tried to distract himself, folding and unfolding a blanket on the couch, but his eyes kept returning to the man in his living room. It was confusing, unsettling, and yet oddly comforting that he thought about the years he had spent hiding parts of himself, never letting anyone close enough to see the truth. The world had taught him to be cautious, to wear masks, to keep his heart tucked away where it couldn't be hurt again. But now, as he listened to the electrician humming softly while working, he felt a crack forming in those walls. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about the past or the fear of rejection. He was thinking about the present, the warmth of another person's presence, the possibility of connection. When the light finally flickered back to life, the room glowed brighter than it had in weeks. But it wasn't just the bulb that illuminated the space, it was something inside him too, something he hadn't felt in years. He smiled, small and hesitant, but real. The electrician glanced at him, catching that smile, and returned it with one of his own. It was a simple exchange, almost ordinary, yet it carried more weight than words could explain. At that moment, he realized the broken light had brought more than electricity back into his home. It had brought the possibility of something he thought he had lost so heavy yet so safe at the same time. After the electrician had finished fixing the light, the room seemed different, brighter in a way he hadn't seen in months. But what unsettled him more was how his own chest felt lighter too, as though someone had quietly opened a window inside his heart. He followed the electrician with his eyes as he packed up his tools, noticing the care he took with every movement, the precision in his hands, the steadiness in his breathing. It was such a simple thing, yet it fascinated him. He had never been the type to focus on strangers, but here he was, tracing the outline of a man's presence and realizing how alive it made him feel. He offered him a glass of water, almost out of politeness, but when their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second as the glass was passed, a spark shot through him that had nothing to do with electricity. He tried to hide the way his stomach turned in on itself, the way his throat tightened. The electrician, however, only gave a polite nod and a soft smile, as though he hadn't noticed. Or maybe he had, and he just wasn't saying anything. They sat for a few minutes, one on the couch, the other on the edge of the chair, the quiet stretching between them. He could hear his own heartbeat in the stillness, every beat reminding him how vulnerable he felt. Normally he avoided this kind of closeness, avoided giving anyone the chance to look too deeply into his life. But this time was different. He found himself wanting the silence to last, because it wasn't awkward, it was grounding. He finally spoke, his voice lower than usual, asking how long he had been working as an electrician. The man answered with an easy laugh, telling him stories of long nights, unexpected calls, and strange situations he had walked into. There was something in his tone, something light and unforced, that made him forget the years of caution he had built up. He listened closely, clinging to every word as though they were filling a space in him that had been empty for too long. The more the electrician spoke, the more he noticed how different he was from the people he usually encountered. There was no judgment in his eyes, no guarded distance. He seemed present, fully there, as though the world outside didn't matter in those minutes they were sharing. And that presence was disarming. It made him lower his own walls without realizing it. He told him little things about himself, small details he rarely shared with strangers, about the books he collected, the way he sometimes left the television on at night just to avoid the silence, how he had once dreamed of leaving this town but never found the courage. He expected indifference, maybe polite nods, but instead he found genuine curiosity in the electrician's face. It was as if every small detail mattered, and that kind of listening felt more intimate than he could have imagined. Something inside him stirred as their conversation stretched on. He noticed the electrician leaning forward slightly, his eyes catching the dim light of the freshly fixed lamp, reflecting warmth that felt almost too personal. He caught himself staring too long, pulling his gaze away before it revealed too much. He tried to remind himself that this was just a man doing his job, a man who would soon leave and probably never return. But no matter how many times he told himself that, his heart refused to listen. His heart beat louder with every laugh they shared, every glance exchanged in the quiet pauses. Time seemed to bend around them. Minutes felt like hours, and yet it all passed too quickly. He realized he didn't want the electrician to leave. He didn't want the sound of his voice to disappear from the walls of his home, or the weight of his presence to vanish from the air. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't afraid of being seen. Instead, he was afraid of being left unseen again. That fear made his words linger in his throat, as if holding him back from saying something he didn't even know how to name. When the electrician finally stood to leave, a wave of panic washed over him, quiet but undeniable. He wanted to ask him to stay, to find some excuse to keep him there just a little longer. But he stayed frozen, his body betraying him as the man gathered his tools. The electrician thanked him politely for the water, thanked him for his patience, and said he could always call again if something else went wrong. The words were simple, professional, but to him they carried more weight than they should have. Call again. He turned those two words over in his mind, gripping them like a lifeline. As the door opened and the cool air from outside swept in, he stood at the threshold, watching the electrician walk toward his van. His chest ached in a strange way, part longing, part fear, part something he hadn't let himself feel in years. He closed the door slowly, leaning against it, his palms pressed flat against the wood as though he could stop the moment from slipping away. The room felt brighter, but also emptier, the light above him glowing steadily while his own thoughts flickered like the bulb had before. He wondered if he was imagining it all, if he was foolish for feeling so deeply about a single encounter. And yet, deep down, he knew it wasn't just imagination. Something had shifted. Something had awakened. He could feel it, like a quiet hum beneath his skin, impossible to ignore. The next morning began like every other, but he felt it wasn't the same. He woke to the sound of his alarm and the faint glow of the fixed light in the corner, steady and calm, but his mind wasn't calm at all. The image of the electrician standing in his doorway, smiling before he left, kept replaying in his thoughts. He moved through his routine slowly, making coffee, staring out the kitchen window, but nothing seemed to ground him. The house felt too big, too silent, and the memory of yesterday filled every corner. He told himself it was nothing, just a passing interaction, but deep down he knew the truth. Something inside him had shifted, and there was no way to return to how things were before. As the day went on, he found himself reaching for his phone again and again, his thumb hovering over the call log where the electrician's number lingered. He told himself it would be ridiculous to call again so soon, that he had no real reason. The light was fixed, the job was done. But the silence pressed harder on him than ever, and every time he thought about hearing that voice again, about seeing those steady eyes, his heart raced. He wrestled with the thought until it exhausted him, but the pull never left. By late afternoon, almost without realizing it, he dialed. He listened to the ring, breath shallow, already half regretting it. When the familiar voice answered, his body loosened, and he almost forgot what excuse he had prepared. He stumbled through words about a faulty switch in the kitchen, his voice wavering slightly, but the electrician only responded with his usual calm, promising he would be by in the evening. The hours between the call and the knock at the door stretched endlessly. He cleaned the house again, even though it was already tidy. He checked his reflection in the mirror too many times, frustrated with himself for caring so much about how he looked. When the knock finally came, he felt that same rush of nerves, the same weight in his chest as before. He opened the door, and there he was again, standing with the same quiet confidence, his eyes lighting up as if he too remembered the first meeting. It wasn't just professionalism. There was warmth in that look, a softness that lingered too long to be an accident. Inside, the electrician went straight to work on the switch, crouching in the kitchen while he stood nearby, watching with a mixture of fascination and nervous energy. He tried to tell himself to stop staring, to step away, but his eyes were drawn to him again and again. His hands, strong yet careful, moved with precision, and the sight stirred something deeper than admiration. It was trust. He realized he trusted this man, someone he barely knew, more than he had trusted people he'd known for years. That realization frightened him, but it also thrilled him. They spoke in fragments as the work continued, little exchanges that carried more weight than their simplicity suggested. The electrician asked about the books stacked on the counter, and he explained his love for reading, how it was his escape when the world felt too heavy. In turn, he learned that the electrician liked to build things, not just fix them, and that he spent weekends helping his uncle with small projects, not for money but for the satisfaction of it. There was no performance in his words, no pretense. It was honesty in its purest form, and it felt like breathing fresh air after being trapped in a closed room for years. When the job was done, the switch working perfectly, neither of them moved to end the moment. They lingered in the kitchen, both hesitant to break the fragile thread of connection that had been quietly weaving itself between them. He offered coffee without thinking, and to his surprise, the electrician accepted. They sat at the small kitchen table, two steaming mugs between them, and for the first time in years, he felt like his home was alive again. The conversation flowed more easily this time, laughter slipping in naturally, pauses filled not with awkwardness but with unspoken understanding. As the evening deepened, the electrician leaned back in his chair, eyes thoughtful, and said something that made his heart stop for a second. He said he liked being here, that the house felt peaceful. The words were simple, but to him, they carried an intimacy he hadn't expected. He swallowed hard, afraid of what might show in his expression, afraid of how his heart was betraying him by pounding so loudly. He managed a smile, but inside, he was trembling. He knew this was more than chance now. This wasn't just about a broken light or a faulty switch. This was about something bigger, something neither of them had spoken aloud yet but both could feel in the quiet between their words. When the electrician finally stood to leave, the goodbye was slower this time, as if both of them wanted to hold on just a moment longer. Their eyes met at the door, and in that glance was 1,000 unspoken things, questions, fears, hope. As the door closed again and the footsteps faded into the night, he stood there in the silence, his chest aching but alive, more alive than he had been in years. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes, and whispered to himself words he hadn't dared to say in a long time. Something is happening. That night he could not sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the steady glow of the newly fixed lights casting shadows across the room, but his mind was louder than the silence. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the electrician sitting at his kitchen table, laughing softly, his eyes reflecting something that felt too much like understanding. It terrified him. It thrilled him. He had built his life around being safe, around keeping his heart locked away where no one could touch it again. Yet here he was, trembling at the thought of a man he had only just met, as though the very fabric of his world had shifted in the span of 2 visits. He told himself it was nothing, just a passing crush, the kind that fades with time. But deep inside, a voice whispered that it wasn't that simple, that this feeling had a weight, a gravity he couldn't fight. As the days passed, he carried the electrician in his thoughts like a secret he didn't want to admit even to himself. At work, he found himself drifting, his attention slipping from the words of his colleagues, the numbers on his screen, the endless loop of tasks. Every little thing reminded him of the way those hands had moved across wires and switches, the quiet ease of his smile, the calm in his voice. It was maddening, and yet he didn't want it to end. For years he had lived numb, buried under layers of caution and loneliness, and now every part of him felt awake again. But along with that awakening came fear. Fear of wanting too much. Fear of being hurt again. Fear of what people would say if they knew. He had spent so long hiding his truth that he wasn't sure if he even knew how to live it anymore. The loneliness that had once been a familiar companion now felt unbearable. Because once you've tasted connection, the absence of it cuts deeper. He found himself staring at his phone again, scrolling through the call log, tempted to create another excuse to bring the electrician back. But shame weighed heavy on him. What if he noticed? What if he realized the calls weren't really about repairs at all? He imagined the look of pity, the awkward silence, the rejection. That thought burned more than the emptiness ever had. So he did nothing. He waited. He lived in a tension between wanting and fearing, his heart pulling him forward while his mind dragged him back. One evening, after a long day of avoiding his own thoughts, he heard a knock at the door. His heart nearly stopped. He hadn't called anyone. For a moment he thought he had imagined it, that his mind was conjuring the sound out of desperation. But when he opened the door, there he was, the electrician. Standing in the same boots, carrying the same toolbox, though this time his smile was different. Softer. Almost hesitant. He explained he was in the neighborhood finishing another job and thought to check if everything was still working fine. The words were practical, but the way he said them carried something else, something unspoken. That he invited him in, his voice unsteady but trying to sound casual. They walked into the living room, and for a few moments neither spoke. The electrician glanced at the light, at the switch, then back at him, and the silence between them felt like a question hanging in the air. It was then he realized the conflict wasn't his alone. He wasn't the only one standing on the edge of something uncertain. The electrician's gaze lingered too long, his words came too carefully, as though he too was balancing between fear and desire. They sat again at the kitchen table, just like before, but the air was different now. Thicker. Charged with something neither could name. He found himself opening up more than he had planned, speaking about the loneliness that had followed him for years, about how the house felt less like a home and more like a shelter he was hiding in. He didn't know why he was saying these things, why he was exposing so much, but the words spilled out because the man across from him listened without judgment, without flinching. The electrician's eyes softened, and he admitted he understood more than he could explain. He spoke of his own struggles, the quiet battles he had fought to be accepted, the scars of rejection that still lingered. In that moment, their truths collided, and something deeper was born between them, but even as warmth spread through his chest, fear clawed at him. The voices of the past returned, voices that told him love was dangerous, that people left, that being honest could cost everything. He looked at the man sitting across from him and wondered if he was strong enough to risk it, if he could survive opening his heart again only to have it shattered. The electrician must have sensed his hesitation because his smile was tinged with something fragile, something that mirrored his own uncertainty. They both knew they were standing at the edge of something fragile and real. When the evening drew to a close, the goodbye at the door was heavier than before. They lingered in the threshold, their eyes locked, neither able to step away. It felt as though a single word, a single gesture, could tip everything into the unknown. But fear held them back. The electrician gave a quiet nod, almost as if promising without speaking, and turned to leave. As the door closed, he pressed his forehead against it, his body shaking with emotions he could no longer deny. For the first time in years, he realized he didn't just want connection. He wanted him. And that truth scared him more than anything. The days that followed were heavy with silence, but it wasn't the same kind of silence he had lived with for years. This silence was alive, filled with longing, questions, and the echo of a presence that refused to leave his thoughts. Every room in the house carried reminders of him, the kitchen table where they had sat, the chair where he had leaned back with a soft laugh, even the switches on the wall that still hummed with the memory of his hands. He told himself to stop, to move on, to treat it as a fleeting moment, but his heart disobeyed at every turn. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that hesitant smile, that quiet gaze that felt like it had seen him in ways no one else ever had. And each time the memory returned, the ache inside him grew sharper, deeper, harder to ignore that he tried to bury himself in his routines, but nothing worked. At work, his focus slipped so badly that colleagues began to notice. In the supermarket, he found himself buying coffee he didn't even drink just because it reminded him of their evenings at the table. At night, he wandered through the house aimlessly, opening doors and closing them again, pacing from room to room as though searching for something he couldn't name. He wasn't used to wanting like this, to carrying desire so openly in his chest. For years he had lived in shadows, safe from hope, safe from disappointment, safe from feeling too much. But now his body betrayed him, craving the sound of footsteps at the door, craving the warmth of someone who had barely even begun to know him that he thought about calling again. He rehearsed excuses in his mind, an outlet that flickered, a breaker that tripped, a question about maintenance, but each one felt hollow, a lie too thin to disguise the truth. And so he did nothing, trapped between the desperate pull of his heart and the heavy chains of his fear. He remembered the last time he had let someone close, how quickly the warmth had turned to cold, how love had turned into absence. The scars of that abandonment still burned, whispering warnings that he was foolish to even consider opening himself again. Yet the silence around him kept pressing harder, reminding him that to do nothing was its own kind of pain. One evening, unable to stand it any longer, he left the house and walked through the quiet streets of his neighborhood. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain. Every step felt restless, driven by an energy he couldn't contain. He didn't know where he was going until he found himself near the edge of town, where the small workshop stood with its glowing sign. He hesitated outside, his chest tight, torn between walking away and pushing forward. Finally, with trembling hands, he stepped inside. The space smelled faintly of metal and sawdust, the air filled with the quiet hum of tools at rest. And there he was, head bent over a workbench, sleeves rolled up, concentration etched across his face. For a moment he simply stood there, breath caught, unsure if he had the strength to move closer. When the electrician finally looked up, surprise flickered across his expression, followed quickly by something warmer, something softer. He put down his tools and wiped his hands, crossing the room with a calmness that only deepened the storm inside him. They exchanged a few simple words, small talk that barely touched the weight of what was unspoken between them. But beneath every word was a current, an electricity far stronger than anything wires could carry. He admitted he had been nearby and decided to stop in, his voice unsteady, almost apologetic. The electrician only nodded, as if he understood the truth beneath the excuse without needing to hear it aloud. They talked quietly, leaning against the workbench, their voices low in the stillness of the shop. For the first time, he allowed himself to really look into the other man's eyes, and what he saw terrified him. It wasn't just kindness or curiosity, it was recognition. As if both of them had been carrying the same emptiness, the same longing, and had finally stumbled upon each other in the dark. The realization left him breathless. The electrician spoke of his own solitude, of nights spent working late just to avoid the quiet of his home. He confessed how rare it was to meet someone who felt safe, someone who felt real. Those words sank deep into his chest, breaking apart the walls he had built brick by brick, but the fear didn't vanish. It rose up stronger, wrapping around his throat, making his hands shake. Because the closer they came, the more he had to lose. What if this was just a passing kindness? What if he was misreading everything? What if opening his heart again only led to the same pain he had sworn he would never endure again? He tried to pull back, to force his emotions into silence, but the warmth of the other man's gaze made it impossible. For every step fear dragged him backward, his heart pulled him 2 steps forward. As they stood there, the air between them heavy with unspoken truths, the electrician reached out and placed a hand gently on his arm. The touch was small, simple, but it felt like the ground shifted beneath his feet. His body froze, his breath caught, and in that instant, he knew. He knew this was no accident, no trick of imagination. This was real. His defenses, his caution, All of it cracked under the weight of that single, steady touch. He wanted to run, and he wanted to stay. He wanted to protect himself, and he wanted to surrender completely. The conflict tore at him, but through it all one truth burned brighter than the rest: he had found someone who made him feel alive again. That night after leaving the workshop, he walked home slowly, each step heavier than the last, his mind in chaos. The air was cool, the streetlights casting long shadows, but nothing around him seemed real. His skin still burned where the electrician's hand had rested, a warmth so simple yet so powerful it shook him to his core. He had wanted to stay there forever, to lean into that comfort, to admit everything his heart had been screaming. But fear had tightened around him like a chain, dragging him away before he could speak. Now, alone in his house once again, the silence felt unbearable. He paced from room to room, restless, haunted by the memory of eyes that had seen too much of him and yet asked for nothing. He knew he was standing on the edge of something life-changing, and the thought both terrified and thrilled him: sleep wouldn't come. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every moment with painful clarity, the way the electrician's voice had softened when he spoke of his own solitude, the way his hand had lingered just long enough to make the world fall away, the look in his eyes that felt like a mirror reflecting his own hidden desires. These were not small details. These were truths carved deep into the space between them, truths he couldn't ignore no matter how hard he tried. And yet, the memories of the past screamed louder, warning him of heartbreak, betrayal, abandonment. He had lived through rejection before, and the wounds of it still ached when he let himself remember. He couldn't let himself be that vulnerable again, could he? But another voice inside whispered that maybe this was different. Maybe this time, he wasn't standing alone. The next day at work he could hardly function. His hands trembled as he typed, his thoughts far away. He snapped at a colleague without meaning to, then immediately regretted it, guilt piling on top of the storm already brewing in his chest. He caught his reflection in the office window and barely recognized himself. His eyes looked tired, but underneath the exhaustion was something else, something raw and alive. It frightened him because he realized he had already crossed a line. He cared too much. He wanted too much. And there was no turning back. That evening, when he returned home, he found himself waiting for something he couldn't name. Each sound outside made his heart race, each passing car a possibility, each footstep a hope. He sat at the table where they had shared coffee, his hands wrapped around an empty mug, and tried to imagine what it would be like if he were brave enough to let this happen. He pictured the electrician sitting across from him again, laughing, leaning closer, filling the silence with warmth. The thought made his chest ache, not just with longing but with fear of how much he had to lose. Later that week, fate made the choice for him. A storm rolled in, dark clouds swallowing the evening sky, heavy rain lashing against the windows. The power flickered, then cut out completely, plunging the house into darkness. His heart pounded as he reached for his phone, and without hesitation, he dialed the one number he had been avoiding. When the electrician answered, his voice steady against the crackle of static, relief washed over him so fiercely it nearly brought tears to his eyes. He explained the outage, his words tumbling out too quickly, betraying the urgency that had little to do with electricity. The man on the other end promised to come right away. When the knock came, it was louder than the storm outside. He opened the door to find the electrician soaked from the rain, his hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes glinting in the dim glow of a flashlight. Something about the sight struck him deeply. This man, standing there despite the storm, carrying more than tools, carrying presence, carrying safety. He ushered him inside quickly, their shoulders brushing as he closed the door, and the contact sent a shiver down his spine. The electrician set to work, moving with practiced ease even in the darkness, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. But all he could do was watch, every nerve in his body alive, every thought colliding with the truth he had been too afraid to face. When the power finally returned, the lights flickering back to life, the room seemed brighter than ever. They stood in the glow, breathing heavily from the storm, the silence between them heavy with meaning. This time he didn't look away. His eyes locked onto the electrician's, and in that gaze was everything he had tried to bury: fear, longing, hope. He wanted to speak, to confess, but his throat closed. Instead, the electrician took a slow step closer, his voice low, almost a whisper, saying that he looked tired, that he had been carrying too much alone. The words cut through him like lightning, striking the truth he had never dared to share. For a moment he felt stripped bare, exposed in ways that terrified him, but instead of retreating, the electrician stayed close, his presence steady, his expression gentle. He didn't demand answers. He didn't push. He simply stood there, offering himself as if to say, "You don't have to do this alone anymore." That quiet offering broke something inside him. His eyes burned with tears he hadn't expected, years of held-in grief and loneliness rising all at once. He turned away, ashamed, but the electrician reached out again, placing a hand on his shoulder. This time he didn't pull back. He let himself feel it, let himself lean into the warmth, even as fear roared inside him. It was not a declaration. It was not a confession. It was just a moment, a fragile, imperfect, powerful moment where two broken hearts met in the storm's aftermath and recognized each other. And though no words were spoken, everything had changed. Because now, for the first time in years, he understood that what frightened him most wasn't losing. It was wanting enough to risk being found. The storm had passed, but inside him the thunder still echoed. That night after the electrician left, he couldn't bring himself to sleep. He sat in the living room with the lights humming softly above him, the silence pressing against his chest in a way that felt heavier than ever before. He replayed every detail of the evening, the way their eyes had locked in the glow after the power returned, the way that steady hand had rested on his shoulder, the way his walls had cracked wide enough for tears to threaten. It terrified him how much it meant. It terrified him how real it felt. For years he had hidden in the shadows of his own fear, convincing himself that safety was found in solitude, but now he knew that was a lie. Safety wasn't in silence. It was in the presence of someone who saw him and didn't look away. The following days blurred into one long ache. He woke each morning with a hollow weight in his chest, carrying both the hope of something new and the dread of losing it before it began. He avoided calling, afraid of seeming desperate, afraid of forcing something that might not exist beyond his own heart. But he also couldn't stop imagining it, what it would feel like to sit across from him again, not as strangers with excuses but as two men who finally dared to admit the truth. His mind waged war against itself, one side urging him to step forward, the other screaming at him to retreat before he got hurt. The conflict exhausted him, and yet he knew he couldn't remain still much longer. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of gold and violet, there was another knock at the door. His heart leapt, recognizing the sound before he even reached for the handle. When he opened it, there he was again, the electrician, standing with a hesitant smile, holding no toolbox this time, only his own quiet courage. For a moment they simply stared at each other, neither sure how to begin. Then, in a voice softer than he had ever heard, the electrician said he had been thinking of him, that he couldn't ignore the pull that kept drawing him back. Those words unraveled him. He had dreamed of hearing them, feared them, longed for them, and now they were real. He invited him inside, his body trembling with both relief and panic. They sat at the same kitchen table that had become their unspoken meeting place, but this time the air between them was charged in a different way. There were no excuses now, no faulty lights or broken switches to hide behind. There was only truth, raw and waiting. He struggled to find words, his voice catching as he admitted how much he had been holding back, how fear had chained him for so long. He spoke of the loneliness that had weighed on him, of the way he had shut himself away after being left before, of how he had convinced himself he wasn't worthy of being seen again. His hands shook as he spoke, but he forced himself to keep going, because for once he didn't want to run from what was real. The electrician listened without interruption, his eyes steady, his face open and kind. When the silence fell, he reached across the table and took his hand, holding it firmly but gently, as though grounding him in the moment. He confessed his own fears too, how he had carried his own scars, how he had wondered if he would ever meet someone who understood the kind of emptiness he lived with. He admitted that from the first time he stepped through the doorway, something had felt different, something had told him that this was not just another call, not just another repair. Hearing those words felt like a door opening inside him, one he had kept locked for years. Tears burned at the corners of his eyes, and though he tried to hold them back, one slipped free. He turned his face away, ashamed, but the electrician squeezed his hand and whispered that he didn't have to hide anymore. That simple sentence broke through everything. The dam inside him gave way, and the tears came, heavy with years of silence and longing. For the first time, he allowed himself to be seen in his most fragile state, and instead of turning away, the man before him held on tighter. They sat like that for a long time, two hands locked together across the table, the room filled with the quiet rhythm of their breaths. No grand declarations were spoken, no dramatic promises, but something more powerful took root, a choice. A choice to stop hiding. A choice to let themselves step into the unknown. When he finally found the courage to meet the electrician's gaze again, he saw the same truth reflected back at him. They were both afraid, but they were both ready. Later, as the night deepened, they stood by the door once more. This time there was no hesitation, no retreat. The electrician stepped closer, closing the space between them until he could feel the warmth of his breath. Their eyes lingered one last time, silently asking and silently answering. When their lips finally met, it was not rushed, not dramatic, but tender and full of everything they had left unsaid. It was a kiss that carried the weight of fear, the depth of longing, and the fragile beauty of hope. When the door closed behind him that night, the silence in the house was different. It was no longer empty. It was alive with possibility. He leaned against the door, his heart racing, tears still wet on his cheeks, and whispered into the quiet, "I'm not alone anymore." The morning after felt different in a way he couldn't quite describe. The sunlight streaming through the curtains seemed softer, warmer, as if the world itself had shifted overnight. He moved through his house with a strange calm in his chest, though underneath it a current of nervous excitement hummed. Every corner of the place carried the weight of last night, the kitchen table where trembling hands had finally held on to something real, the hallway where unspoken truths had poured out in fragile words, the doorway where hesitation had finally given way to the gentlest of kisses. Nothing about the house had changed, but everything about what it meant to him had. For years it had been a place of solitude, a shelter he convinced himself was enough. But now, walking through it, he realized it no longer felt like walls holding him in, it felt like a space that had been waiting to be shared. The day stretched on, filled with thoughts that refused to leave him alone. He caught himself smiling at random moments, then quickly stopped, almost embarrassed by how deeply joy unsettled him after living so long without it. He wondered if it was real, if last night was truly a turning point or just a fragile dream that might break in the daylight. Doubt clung to him, whispering reminders of everything he had lost before, of the risks in opening his heart again. But each time fear tried to take over, he remembered the firmness of that hand gripping his, the softness of that voice saying he didn't have to hide anymore, and the doubts weakened. Those moments had been real, and for once, he allowed himself to believe in them. By evening, he couldn't resist any longer. His phone sat on the table, the screen lighting up with nothing but silence, yet his fingers hovered above it for what felt like hours. Finally, with a breath that felt like jumping off a cliff, he sent a simple message, "dinner." No excuses this time, he stared at the words, his heart racing, and before he could even begin to regret sending them, the reply came. Yes. Tell me when, the relief that surged through him was so overwhelming it almost made him laugh, though tears stung his eyes at the same time. He set the time, and for the rest of the evening he busied himself in the kitchen, fussing over details he never cared about before, how the table looked, what dishes to make, whether the lighting was too harsh or too dim. Every small act felt like preparing for something sacred, because in his heart, it was, when the knock finally came, it was softer than before, but it carried the same weight, the same pulse of something inevitable. He opened the door, and there he was again, not with tools or excuses, but simply with a smile that reached his eyes. This time, the hesitation was gone. They embraced briefly, awkwardly at first, then more firmly, both of them holding on a little too long, neither willing to let go. As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed more easily than it ever had. There was laughter, real laughter that shook loose the dust of years of silence. There were pauses too, filled with the kind of quiet that didn't need to be filled, the kind that spoke of comfort instead of emptiness. Every glance felt heavier than words, every touch more grounding than explanations. After dinner, they lingered at the table, unwilling to let the night end. Their stories spilled out, deeper this time, more vulnerable. He spoke of the scars he had carried for too long, of the loneliness that had been his closest companion. The electrician shared his own burdens too, admitting how he had convinced himself love wasn't meant for him, that he had resigned himself to being needed only for what he could fix, not for who he was. Together, they let the weight of their pain sit between them, not as something that divided but as something that finally connected. For the first time, neither of them felt strange in their brokenness. They felt seen, accepted, understood. When the night deepened and the dishes sat forgotten, they found themselves on the couch, shoulders touching, the closeness both unfamiliar and entirely natural. He leaned his head back, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, and whispered how scared he still was, how part of him kept waiting for this to disappear. The electrician turned to him, his gaze steady, and simply said, "I'm scared too. But I'm here. That has to be enough for now." Those words sank into him, not as a promise of perfection but as something more real, a choice to stay, even through fear. As the hours slipped by, the weight that had clung to him for years began to loosen. He realized that healing wasn't about erasing scars but about finding someone who could touch them without making them hurt more. He realized that love wasn't about grand gestures or flawless confessions, but about small, steady moments where two people chose not to let go. That night, as they finally drifted to sleep side by side, the silence in the house was no longer heavy. It was full, alive, carrying the rhythm of two hearts that had finally found their way to each other. For the first time in years, he didn't dread tomorrow. He welcomed it. Because tomorrow no longer meant facing the world alone. It meant waking up with someone who had seen the worst parts of him and stayed. And that single truth was more shocking, more beautiful, than anything he could have ever imagined when he first picked up the phone and called for help with the lights.